Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Andrew Harrop. I'm the General Secretary of the Fabian Society. And this is a special meeting. It's got a slight end of term feel because, you know, Parliament is rising and it's the end of the political year. And what a year or 6 months it's been since the general election, leadership contest for the Labour Party, COVID-19. And one of the effects of it is that it really feels like some of the ongoing important reforms that we've been debating over the last 3 or 4 years have really been sidelined, and improving the quality of work and addressing modern working practices is certainly one of those. So we thought it would be really important to have a discussion at the Fabian Society about progress on the improvement of work, an agenda that was really kicked off by the Conservative government under Theresa May when she commissioned Matthew Taylor to do his review of modern working practices. And that was published 3 years ago this week, which is why we wanted to come together. It was a really extensive piece of work, lots of proposals, perhaps didn't go quite as far as the Labour Party would have liked to, but it had made some important suggestions and reforms, many of which were accepted as proposals by Theresa May's government. Some of them were implemented, but an awful lot of them were accepted and nothing's happened since. So important for us on the left to take stock and hold to account the Conservative government for commitments they've made. But also, we of course need to look at what's happened since with COVID-19. Now, inevitably, we're worrying about the quantity of jobs at the moment and the spectre of huge rising unemployment, but we mustn't lose sight of the quality of work either. Making sure that we have a good jobs agenda, not just an any jobs agenda, and particularly that that newer forms of work that might raise job insecurity are properly watched and regulated, rather than us just becoming fixated on people having a job of any sort. Later in the summer, or it might just sneak into September, the Fabian Society and Community Union are publishing the final report of our 2-year commission on workers and technology, which Yvette Cooper is chairing. And that report includes one chapter on good quality work. And we'll be hearing in a few minutes from Josh Aby, who's the project's lead researcher, who will give us a little sneak preview of some of the proposals that the Commission on Workers and Technology were making on good work and modern working practices. But before then, we've got not one but 2 shadow ministers who have responsibility for this brief. So we'll be hearing from Seema Malhotra, who is in the DWP team as the shadow employment minister. And so Seema's responsibility is basically the unemployment and helping people into work side of the agenda. Also has responsibility for some labour market institutions. And then on the other side, we have Andy McDonnell, who's the Shadow Secretary of State for Labour and job security. And Andy will be talking to us really from the perspective of labour market regulation and making sure that both workers have rights and trade unions have rights. So I don't mean we didn't discuss before we started, Andy and Seema, what running order you want to go in. Maybe if I start with Seema first, as Andy's just joined us. So just a few minutes each for you to sort of set out your thoughts on good work and modern working practices, the Taylor review 3 years on, and particularly thinking about what's changed because of the COVID-19 crisis. So Seema, let me start with you.
Thank you very much, Andy, and thank you to the Fabians for hosting today. I do agree with you that with the 3 years since the Taylor review, this is a really important moment for us to mark, and for us to mark in Labour. We know the reasons that it was set up, and we know that there was a very important debate with a number of recommendations, over 50 that were brought forward, and only about 7 of them actually having been legislated for since then. And if there's anything that we can say about today's moment, almost unexpectedly, that this 3rd anniversary is a really important time to review and to look at how we might accelerate some of the progress and certainly some of the debate around insecure work and rights at work. And I do want to just use this opportunity to reflect on that in the light of the employment crisis we face and some of the statistics and some of the story of this slowdown and recession compared to previous ones, and some lessons that we need to learn and respond to. Andy, I'm really pleased to work with, because Andy's got a very complementary brief around employment rights. We've already made a couple of interventions together. And I think in terms of looking at kind of strategically around the economy and good work and what that looks like, we've got to combine that as part of a story around an inclusive economy with some principles that we should review and I think debate in the Labour Party around what good work looks like. I'm really keen as well to hear what Josh has to say, because I've seen the work that the Fabians are doing over the last couple of years, particularly around some of the sort of macroeconomic and technological changes that we have to face when we're looking at the changing nature of the workplace and the economy, because we have to recognize as well that people's jobs are likely to change many more times in their lifetime. So the idea of a job for all and not needing to reskill, not needing to respond to some of those challenges in technology and how that might change both how products and services are developed but also delivered. How do we also upskill and respond to that? What are the threats and what are the opportunities, and what are the attitudes, public attitudes towards that? And how do we deal with both some of those fears but also some of the sort of grasping of those opportunities? But let me just reflect for a few minutes as well, because the British Labour movement, I think, we should be confident and proud about this. It's had a history of both a sort of industrial and political wing that has really been born out of this kind of struggle to create good work for all. It's absolutely been in our DNA since the founding of the Labour Party. And I think you can see that our history has also been punctuated with key struggles, decisively turning the dial on the public debate around fair employment and fair work. And we've seen that through things like safety at work with the Match Girl strike, also decent pay and stable employment with the Great Dock strike. And there will be many other examples that are littered through history. And what that says is that good work is absolutely intrinsic to the very fibre of our movement. And that's why, in my view, with a government that doesn't really have a policy direction around this, we have to be the party that's leading how we're responding to this crisis as well, because this is not just a period about responding to the crisis of any work. I think the way Andy phrased it was really, really important. But when you make decisions now about a recovery, you've got to make decisions with a mind to how that recovery is going to be inclusive and what's the legacy of it, because those foundations you set through government policy, and there's going to be another intervention with the budget in the autumn, are going to set the direction of travel. They are going to incentivize certain behaviors, and they are going to incentivize certain ways that we see the recovery. So I think as we develop this, we should bring back to life, I think, debates about good work, about the good workplace, because I think the workplace has come under increasing scrutiny and spotlight, not just in terms of COVID safe standards, but how the COVID experience has seen us balancing work and the office in a different way in where people actually are doing their work, and how quickly we've been able to adapt to that. And that's not just in workplaces that have been sort of office based. The message I heard from our local hospital at the AGM they had this afternoon was very much how COVID had taught them about the adaptability in their own workplace, and how attitudes had changed, and how much people had really felt much more rewarded for being able to step into other places of need in the hospital during that COVID sort of peak. And so I think some principles I just want to sort of suggest that we think about having a good workplace that is safe, and safe for, not just non-injurious to physical health, but also mental health, safe from exploitation, a place where we, a sense of safety, that there'll be enforcement against low core standards. I think Andy's work on Leicester and what we've learned over the recent period is really important on that too. Fulfilling work with a status and reward and sense of well-being. I think these are really underlooked areas in a current climate in which we've seen the rise of sort of people feeling insecure and not valued either in society or in the workplace. So how can work be looked at as fulfilling, and how do we embed that? Rewarding work that also looks at structures of pay, and how do we end poverty pay, incentivizing advancement, refocusing on the living wage. Flexible work, allowing workers to move between places, roles, careers and hours. We've got, I think, a renewed focus on family life, personal enrichment, human flourishing. Those were, really important areas for the Labour Party, because human flourishing has got to be, and a good society and the good life are very Fabian spaces, but they are products of how we think about and structure work and the workplace. And also robust, because I think employment through life, and if we were even to take an ambition like, and why shouldn't we, an ambition to end long-term unemployment for all, what would that actually look like? How can we see employment for all and good work being able to withstand the seismic changes of the global economy, the rise of automation and digital, the greening of our economy, and some of those changes that have to necessarily come? So I think I'll just close after just making sort of one final observation about why we need to focus, and it's essential that we focus on an inclusive economy, because this hasn't been an unequal economic crisis. We've seen women and lone parents hit particularly hard. We've seen ethnic minority communities being hit hard, both in terms of the health impact of COVID, but also in terms of loss of jobs and loss of income, because there are two parts to this. One is the loss of income, even if you're staying in your job, which has resulted in real difficulties in managing the household finances at the end of the month, and what that is meaning for the rise of poverty and the slow and sustained rise of poverty in our communities. And how we, I think in terms of the earnings of single parents, it's pretty stark that it's fallen by more than double the amount experienced by households with children and more than one adult. Now, that's one of the reasons why we've said that the benefit cap should be lifted, because some of the data in London has shown how households have lost out on hundreds of pounds a month through an arbitrary cap that should be lifted, particularly in this crisis. So how we also look at the needs of the self-employed who have been hit very hard, knowing that after the last recession, we saw about 40% of employment has been in the rise of the self-employed, not always by choice and more often not by choice, but as a means of surviving and not necessarily thriving, because you don't see high income levels often with those who are self-employed and in the gig economy. And so when we've come to the measures to help us address the COVID crisis, we've seen many of those groups and those who are in precarious work not included in some of the government's main schemes. And that lack of inclusion has not just seen them suffer during this downturn while others have been on furlough, but also is not setting them up well for how we look to the recovery. So I'll just finish there by saying that alongside a jobs plan, we need an active way in which we're engaging people in the jobs for the future. That also means a skills plan, which is absent from how the government is working at the moment. But above all, we need to have an inclusive economy that looks again, as well as one of the key points being made by our DWP team, at the fit for purpose nature of our social security system, that should be much fairer, that should be there when people need it, and that should be responsive and personalized and travel through life as people go through their work journeys, to be that security when people need it, and also enable them back into the workplace in a sustained manner and with a very positive attitude to people's opportunities and prospects for themselves and their families for the future. Thank you.
Seema, thanks so much. So now we're going to turn to Andy McDonald. Andy, it's a pleasure to have you in the meeting. When Keir decided on his shadow cabinet, he specifically created the role that Andy holds, the Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights, because it's such a high priority for the Labour Party and the Labour movement. So Andy, really pleased to hear your thoughts on how we don't just focus on jobs, but on good jobs.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah. And I was really honoured that Keir sustained the role, and I've got a good legacy to rest on and develop from Laura Pidcock and from Rachel Maskell, of course. So I'm very grateful to them. Yeah, and it's good to be talking to you on the 3rd anniversary of the Taylor Review. And obviously the impact of coronavirus has totally reshaped the world of work for many people. And whilst a number of the recommendations made in the review are still incredibly pertinent to this new world that we find ourselves in, some of the recommendations I think are perhaps less appropriate than they were 3 years ago. And as Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights and Protections, I'll keep my remarks focused on the major points made in the review regarding workplace rights, in particular the 6th of the 7 steps towards fair and decent work with realistic scope for development and fulfilment. Namely that we need to develop a more proactive approach to health. And I do take issue with the review's suggestion that national regulation isn't the route to achieve better work. And as we go through the greatest health crisis in a century, and what's set to be the deepest economic crisis in 3 centuries, the establishment of a department for employment couldn't be more appropriate to oversee a safe return to work and the creation of an economy that works for the many by supporting green industry and a clean recovery. Government intervention to keep workers safe and uphold their rights shouldn't be seen as red tape, as some would have us believe. And of course, the laissez-faire approach taken by the Tories with regard to protection of workers during, but also in the years leading up to the coronavirus, has shown itself to be fundamentally flawed. And the government's been too slow to act at each step of the handling of the crisis, both with its failure to protect workplace health and safety, and more broadly, its failures to protect the lives and the livelihoods of the population at large. And the Tories' austerity cuts to the HSE has left it with half the budget and 2/3 of the number of inspectors it enjoyed under the last Labour government. And it's obviously chipped in £14 million of emergency funds. That will go nowhere towards addressing the £100 million plus funding that was slashed from it over the last decade. And it still lacks the resources to fulfil its statutory role, as Seema and I highlight on a regular basis. And having been so stripped back by years of austerity, few prosecutions are ever brought, leaving workers in unsafe conditions. And in 2018-19, only 361 convictions were secured. That's a drop of almost half compared with 2015-16. As I said, the HSE wasn't adequately resourced before the pandemic, and it certainly isn't resourced to meet the challenge of enforcing workplace health and safety on a widespread return to work outside the home. Safety in shops, offices and warehouses is the responsibility, as we know, of local authorities. The cuts to their finances has meant there's now only 543 full-time equivalent local authority inspectors. That's responsible for 1.7 million premises. So that means that the average workplace can expect an inspection once in 260 years. And sadly, we've seen some appalling behaviour on the part of some employers, which have been brought to light. You'll have seen, hopefully, the attention given on Twitter to the terrible case of the cleaners in South London, who were employed through an outsourcing agency. They went on strike after being denied months of wages, and they wanted PPE, and they were told that you can have your PPE as long as you get rid of the union, and you can have your London living wage if you get rid of the union. Well, they've been embarrassed into turning around on some of that, but not, sadly, on directly employing people. Seema mentioned the horrific practices in the Leicester garment industry. That's been brought to the fore on the ongoing issue of the underpayment of the national minimum wage, and how this criminal abuse of workers is in fact a hazard for public health. But Leicester is just the tip of the iceberg. Almost 1 million workers who were nominally on the minimum wage at the beginning of the last financial year were actually underpaid. And yet the Conservative government isn't even calculating the cost to the Treasury from the loss of income tax revenue. And I hardly suggest they care for the interest of the taxpayer, let alone low-paid workers who are being so criminally exploited. And the Taylor Review was right to stress how a top concern of workers is the issue of unpaid wages. However, the past few months have shown how vital national regulation of workplaces and enforcement, both in terms of health and safety and the enforcement of the minimum wage, is key to achieving better work. And looking to the future, as Keir has said, there can't be any return to business as usual as we get through the crisis. Working people's lives and livelihoods must be given all the protections that a developed democratic society has to offer. And although it's good to see the developments have been made in recent months with a number of legal cases, and we eagerly await the judgments from the Supreme Court on the Uber and the Asda cases, which deal with areas that the Taylor Review speaks to, namely the issue of employment status and equal pay, we shouldn't have to rely purely on the judicial system for progress in the area of employment rights and protections. And it's really worrying to read that the government are flirting with the idea of reintroducing tribunal fees. If you think of the backlog that we've got in unfair dismissal cases, to bring the fees back would be a disaster. So what we need is a new deal for working people, one that speaks to their economic and social rights, that reinstitutes sectoral collective bargaining to bring about secure employment, with fair wages for all workers from day one of their employment, regardless of their gender or ethnicity, that helps build an economy that can address the existential challenges posed by climate change. So in the coming months and years, there's going to be a big political argument about the world of work, and in light of COVID and other challenges, such as automation and climate change, and no doubt the Fabian Society will play an important role in shaping that argument, particularly with the publication of the report on the Commission on Workers and Technology. But what the history of the labour and trade union movement has taught us is that only through collective struggle will we defeat injustices within and without the workplace. And what the coronavirus crisis has taught us is that governments can take steps to intervene in an economy in ways that for a long time have seemed impossible. In my view, it's our duty, as and when we come out of this crisis, to have a better deal for working people and a fundamental departure from the exploitation of workers and grossly unequal practices that have obtained in our recent history, leaving working people exposed, unprotected, and insufficiently rewarded. We simply have to make the change and secure a better settlement and a better future. And it's really interesting as we're prepared to talk to you tonight that I signed off a press release about the abuses in Mike Ashley's Shirebrook empire, where workers are not being paid for their breaks and cannot leave. These are dreadful conditions that people are suffering under. So the challenge is a huge one, but I think there's a real appetite for change in our country. People recognize the value of a myriad of workers who haven't been properly acknowledged or treated with dignity and respect. And I think this is a key moment in our history, and we are poised and ready to take that agenda forward. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation with the Fabian Society and others, because it's the Labour Party in government that's going to deliver on it. Thank you.
Andy, thanks so much. And we'll get into a lot more of the detail of what you've said once we're into the question and answer and discussion. And so just before I bring Josh in, just to tell you how that's going to work, you're, I'm sure, very used to the Zoom system now. What we'd like you to do, if you do want to ask a question or make a comment, is write your name in chat to me. or it's the whole group. And I will basically try to call people roughly in order that you tell me that you'd like to make a contribution. But before we do that, we're going to hear from Josh Aby, who's a researcher at the Fabian Society. Josh is going to speak to, as I said, one of the chapters of the forthcoming report of the Commission on Workers and Technology. Basically, the report is split into 4 chapters. One of them looks at fair rewards, as we have the impact of technology. One of them looks at training and support. A third looks at voice and representation and the role of trade unions. And the fourth looks at good work, improving the quality of our work in a very day-to-day basis. So Josh, if you'd like to talk us through that chapter in particular and how it plays to the points that Seema and Andy have already made.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andy, for that. And also thanks to Seema and Andy for being part of this discussion. I think it's really heartening and important to see that the Labour Front bench is, taking very seriously the issues around the quality of work as well as quantity, which latter is understandably the preoccupation of the debate at the moment, given concerns around the rise in unemployment. But it's equally as important that we discuss these issues as well. So yeah, as Andy said, I'm going to talk to this work we've been doing for the past almost 2 years now on the Commission on Workers and Technology. It's a commission that's chaired by Yvette Cooper, who is a former Labour Work and Pension Secretary. So she's brought a great amount of expertise to this project. I mean, it's also a partnership with a trade union called Community, who, for obvious reasons, have a huge amount of expertise in sort of what goes on day to day in workers' lives and their experiences of the world of work. So I'll jump straight into, as Andy says, the good work chapter of this report and the kinds of things that we found, and also some of our sort of emerging thoughts around recommendations for the future. I should say actually that Andy just mentioned that one of our chapters is around fair rewards, and I'm also going to talk about one component of that fair rewards chapter here, which is about pay, because I think some of these kind of chapter distinctions are somewhat arbitrary. It's all about good work really, but pay is probably something that most workers consider to be a component of the quality of their jobs. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the findings around the interaction between automation and pay. Obviously, also just before I do that, just to start, the work of the Commission, as the case with all of our lives, has been sort of turned upside down by this COVID crisis, and there are plenty of very sort of interesting and troubling interactions between the recession that we've almost certainly already entered, and the issues around automation and technology change that we were already looking at. So I'll touch on some of those as well as I go through. So the first thing to say about automation and good work is that there are reasons to be cheerful as well as reasons to be worried. Coming to pay first, actually one of the reasons to be hopeful in some ways centers on this pay question. Kind of short explanation of how this works is that ultimately automation raises productivity, and our history tells us earnings tend to rise as productivity in the economy rises. Now, we mustn't take for granted that relationship. We need policy measures to make sure that link between earnings and productivity remains strong. But that's one reason why we think this, increasing automation can actually be a good thing for workers. A second reason to be cheerful is when we've spoken to workers themselves, whether that's through nationally representative polling or whether it's through focus groups with workers who have experienced technology change in their workplaces over the last few years, the vast majority of people are positive about the impact it's had. So the aspiration is for that to continue and for the effects to improve even further. Another reason to be hopeful is that most of us, a lot of us who work in office jobs have discovered many of the benefits of flexible working, particularly recently, the capacity to work at home, to have a greater degree of control over your working hours because of technologically enabled practices. for people who do shift work, greater flexibility over rostering and that kind of thing. And finally, a reason to be cheerful is that technology can, has the potential to make work essentially safer and fairer if it's used in the right way. So, there are lots of jobs that people do in the economy still today that, contain dangerous tasks and, to a lesser degree of seriousness, very repetitive tasks that aren't necessarily fulfilling in the ways that, Seema talked about, fulfilling work for the future. And automation, on the plus side, has the capacity to take over some of those, less desirable tasks that we do in our jobs, and open up space for workers to do more interesting, more creative tasks that add more value to their lives. So that's a brief overview of the positives of, where technology change can take us if we manage to grasp the opportunities and go about things in the right way. But on the flip side, we've also come across plenty of reasons to be concerned. And as I go through these, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the policy measures that we've been kind of thinking about, some of the principles behind those measures that we'll be setting out in our report, which will be published later this summer. So the first reason to be concerned, and it kind of relates to the broader employment and sort of pay side of things, is and this is more to do with the COVID recession than it is to do with automation. But more unemployment is not just bad for the quantity of jobs, but it is bad for the quality of jobs, because more employment means workers have less bargaining power. It means that, for workers to be able to negotiate good pay with their employers, it requires a low level of employment across the board. So a sustained increase in unemployment is bad for pay and bad for terms and conditions when workers are coming to agree those things with their employers. So, several things that we can think about to address that issue of unemployment as this COVID recession unfolds. We need government to bring together workers and unions and employers to focus plans for sectors which have been particularly hard hit by this crisis. And that means, more ambitious than the sectoral deals that have already been struck between sectoral stakeholders in some sectors already. It really means sort of transformational plans that set out how we're going to introduce kind of new technology into jobs, how we're going to sustain employment levels, and redesign jobs in the new economic context and the new public health context as well. Another thing we need is investment in growth industries, including the tech industry. There are a whole number of industries where jobs can be created, as well as where jobs are under threat. But that investment, in particular investment from government, needs to come with conditions attached, and government needs to receive assurances that the jobs that will be created are going to be good quality jobs. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And we also need to see increased public service spending, because some of these growth sectors, for example, in education and care, these are ones where government has, direct control, and government in some ways controls the employment level by determining how much it spends in these sectors. There's rising demand in these sectors too, so that would be an appropriate response from government to tackle, or as part of an approach to start to tackle unemployment. Second concern is that automation and COVID, the COVID recession, are hitting low pay sectors in particular. That's where most of the impact is due to be, according to the analysis. Hospitality, food and drink services, accommodation, retail, these are some of the sectors where that low pay persists despite increasing levels of automation. Some of the workers we've spoken to see new tech being introduced alongside their jobs, displacing some of their colleagues in some cases, but the productivity gains aren't being realized and shared with them. So what we need to see is, and the government's commitments on the national living wage have actually been fairly admirable, but there's the risk that the main commitment of government, which is to raise the national living wage to 2/3 of median income by the middle of the decade, sort of falls by the wayside in the wake of the issues that we're seeing with unemployment. So we need firmer commitments and perhaps a legislative commitment to keeping that on track. And we also need to see more collective bargaining across the economy. So, you know, the national living wage, raising it helps people at the lower end of the income distribution. But as you move further up towards the middle of the income distribution, what really makes a difference to wages and incomes and growth in incomes is collective bargaining. So, you know, we need measures to make union recognition easier, give unions better access to workplaces. We do, as Andy touched on, we need a framework for collective bargaining at the sectoral level, particularly in these low-pay industries where union membership is very low. So very few workers are represented by unions in exactly the workplaces where they should be represented by unions. So rolling out collective bargaining. Another issue, technology is in some cases, on the flip side of flexibility, is facilitating more insecurity. So, you know, technology, you know, app-based working, various platforms are making it easier to break up work into discrete tasks, with the result that self-employment is rising, but not necessarily the kind of self-employment that people choose because it gives them greater autonomy, but the kind of self-employment that rises because, you know, the tasks that used to be done by employees in traditional jobs with their associated social protections are no longer available as those kinds of jobs. So to kind of combat that move towards contracting out, towards you know, precarious gig work where it's not beneficial to workers, you know, government needs to take action when it comes to the financial incentives that employers have to contract out work instead of you know, employing an employee to do a given job. We also think that, and touching on the Taylor Review, one of the recommendations that the government accepted was to bring forward legislation to clarify and improve the definitions of employment statuses, different employment statuses. That legislation, we haven't seen it, and it needs to come back onto the agenda. And another slightly more novel idea to kind of deal with some of the issues in the platform economy, the gig economy, is for the government to essentially compel platform businesses, as well as unions, to come together at the national level, sit down around the table and sort of work out a plan for making sure that, you know, workers can still benefit from the flexibility of these new types of jobs, but also are provided with the social protections that traditional employee jobs come with. Another concern, this is the penultimate concern I'm going to talk about today, is the increased capacity for technology-enabled monitoring and surveillance that we've seen as technology change advances. So I mean, we've all heard about the Amazons of the world, with, you know, workers being forced to urinate in plastic bottles because they're so tightly monitored that, you know, they don't feel able to take a toilet break. But it's more widespread than just the Amazons. A TUC report from a couple of years ago found that 3/4 of workers suspect that they're being monitored by technologically enabled means in their workplace. Again, our approach to mitigating this risk of technology change is basically bringing together employers and trade unions to decide, you know, what does society think is acceptable and unacceptable when it comes to monitoring and surveillance, and laying that down in legislation. And also having flexibility on a workplace level, but making sure that before employers introduce any new kind of technological surveillance, workers are consulted, trade unions are consulted before the implementation. And just finally, I'm probably running over my allotted time, but the final concern I want to talk about is, while it should be making work easier, and it is in many cases, in lots of other cases, new technology and automation is actually intensifying work for a lot of people. Now, one aspect of this is the kind of working from home culture, the always on culture that's, you know, interacting with the COVID crisis to become increasingly pervasive in a lot of our lives. But as well as that, you know, technology actually technology itself adding more work into our working day. So, you know, automated scheduling, not taking account of workers who need rest breaks, for example. Yeah, so that kind of practice of you know, more intensity, more stress is something we've definitely found across the labour market. And I think one potential solution here is to look at the principles behind the French right to disconnect law. And what this is something that the French government brought in a couple of years ago, which asks larger employers to sit down and negotiate terms and guidance for what they call a right to disconnect, which essentially means being able to, you know, not being obligated to engage with the digital tools that you use in your workday outside of working hours. Obviously, how each employer implements that kind of thing should be done on a case-by-case basis, but we think there's something in that principle. And all of this is kind of also addressed by one of the things we're thinking of recommending, which is essentially a nationwide good work standard that is ultimately formulated by employers and trade unions coming together and debating and discussing, but is then taken on by government and is on the one hand voluntary, but on the other hand is used as something that government can use to decide who when firms engage and require government money for procurement or for investment in innovation, the government can ask, you know, are you complying with these good work standards that have been agreed, or are you working towards them? And that being a kind of condition for engagement with government and receipt of government money. So that's a brief but actually quite long overview of that good work chapter. So I'll hand back to Andy.
Josh, thank you very much. Right, well, it's over to all of you with time for some discussion and questions. I said a minute ago, put your name in the chat if you want to ask a question. If you've got your camera on, you can, of course, just wave your hand at me instead. So you've got two options there. I haven't got any names coming through to the chat at the moment. I hope it's working. Does anyone want to ask a question or make a short comment? I'm looking at anyone with their hand. No one's raised their hand so far, and no one's put their. I've got Martin. Martin, do you want to start? And then others can be inspired to ask a question afterwards. You're on mute. Let's put you off mute. Try again, Martin.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. A lot of focus at the moment on what happens related to COVID, but I'm very concerned about the long term, and I think we have to think 10, 15 years ahead, because a lot of the protections that workers had in the past were related to a situation where they stayed with one employer for quite a long time. They built up considerable service. They had rare skills, they had valuable skills which those employers needed. And what seems to be happening increasingly now is that jobs are becoming less skilled, so that workers don't have the same differentiation from others that they had, which was the protection in the past. And with a shifting population of people working much shorter periods with one employer, their service-related benefits through the legal system, through the tribunal system, have been eroded. And I think that in a situation where people are moving more rapidly, then trade unionism finds it more difficult to organise and is less of a benefit. So the benefits that people had in the past of working with valuable skills with one employer for a long time have long gone. And so I think we can't think back to the models that used to work in the past. Tribunals and trade unions are not going to be as effective in what I see as becoming an increasingly casualised labour market, and I think that's very dangerous. So I'm not sure how we do this. I think harking back to relying on trade unionism, although that would be very welcome, I don't think that's going to be sufficient, and I think a lot has to be done to give people individual rights. The tribunal system was intended to do that, but that fails unless people have got considerable service. So I'm very concerned that the whole nature of the labour market is changed already, and I think it will increasingly change, partly through some of the reasons that Josh talked about. And I think there's a whole cohort of particularly younger workers coming through who haven't got the job security, often combined with housing insecurity problems, that they had in the past. And I think we've got a fundamental look over the next 10, 15 years as to how work is going to develop and find innovative ways of protecting workers.
Martin, thank you very much for that comment. Excellent points. I'm going to bring in Jill and then Maya, and then we'll go back to the panelists. Jill Timms, and I think I need to switch you on. There you go. Hi, Jill. Can you? Yes, you're on. Go ahead, Jill.
Hi. Really enjoying the debate, thank you, on all those points. It was just something I saw yesterday, and given that we've touched already on the importance of direct employment and of the problems with subcontracting, I just wondered what people thought about the announcement from Tesco that they'll be dropping in some of their smaller stores contracted cleaners and taking that in-house, although it does sound like it will be the retail staff that will have it as additional duties. So I just wondered what response there was to that.
Great, thanks, Jill. And Maya Chatterjee.
Okay, well, I think that the other two questions were related and mine is not, but anyway, here it is. Is there any think tank or research group looking into what monitoring by technology is acceptable or is unacceptable to most people? That's the public and the workers involved.
Great. I'll bring in Josh just on that question, because I know he's been researching this, and then bring in Seema and Andy to cover, well, all three. But Josh, do you want to just respond on that point?
Yeah, so I know the TUC have done a lot of work on this. The work that I referenced about, you know, the number of workers who are worried that they're being surveilled. It's a couple of years old, but I think the TUC are sort of consistently on top of this kind of issue. They're working with their member unions to work through the issues that are being brought to the unions by workers about monitoring and surveillance. I know that there's a think tank called the Ada Lovelace Institute, which is focused on technology. And I don't know whether they're looking at this particular question actually at the moment around, you know, general perceptions amongst the general population, amongst workers and amongst employers around what's acceptable. But I think, you know, that kind of thing would fall within their remit. But I mean, I think it's an important part of the question, and I think this is why I think there needs to be a public debate on this. You know, there isn't a rough and ready answer to, you know, what is and what isn't acceptable, and there's probably no one size fits all solution, because, you know, different contexts apply in different workplaces. But it's something we at least need to be talking about, that we're probably not doing enough of already. Yeah.
Thanks, Josh. Seema, can I hand over to you on all those questions?
Thanks very much. I mean, they are fantastic questions, and I think it's a really fantastic and future-looking piece of work that Fabians have done. I'll just make a few brief comments. So I know with time being tight, look, on Martin's points, those were really, really important. You know, your phrase of the casualised labour market is a really important one as well, and the need to look long term. This is why I was making the point that the decisions that are made can be made in, you know, with a short term focus, but you can equally be thinking long term and to make some decisions that are more likely to have longer term impact. And that's, I think, an argument that I'll be, you know, certainly within our teams around the economic recovery needing to make, and needing other institutions to make, so that the government doesn't fall into the trap when it comes to the budget of looking for an immediate hit. And I think the financial statement fell into that trap in some respects, where we didn't see some of the interventions that we may have needed and still do around more sector-specific support that's kind of drip feeding out. The consequence of that is job losses, because employers don't have the confidence that the government's going to be backing them through a sort of a delayed and recovery for some sectors. There's another big part of a debate that I've been, really thinking about, which is about how you can structure transferability of skills and how employers can think differently about that, how you can look at qualifications in a different way, so that there's a sort of middle layer of thinking about how you can create a sort of a skill set that allows for what is maybe more job specific or sector specific, but also what could be more core going across different types of employment. And I think that that's really important, particularly when you think about green skills, because around green skills, which we talk about a lot, there's been quite a lot of research done on this, not nearly enough recently, and not nearly enough to implement some of this recently. And it also does need a big refresh. But a distinction made between light green and dark green, with those that are the more generic skills, and then there's the more sector specific. And if we're to look at how there's a skills strategy that has to go with lifelong learning and people possibly changing jobs or needing to upskill, I think we have to think in a different way about how we structure courses and how we look at transferability of skills. And in a sense, we're rushing to catch up on some of that locally in Hounslow, around the aviation community we're in, not least because I've got the third highest number of furloughed employments in the country. And getting people into work again, if they lose their jobs, is a challenge. It's one of the reasons why I've talked about an employer-to-employer bridge, because I think if you take, for example, you only need to notify the government if you're going to make more than 20 people redundant. In my view, that needs to be lower, because otherwise you're creating a kind of a massive extra demand around an unprepared job centre environment, and you don't give the early warnings either to other employers to say, what are your needs, or to the system, and it's sort of dumped on the state to try and then draw back and recover. But ideally, you would find different ways in which we were working together, and indeed on how skills can work across jobs. Some of the work that David Blunkett has also done, looking at how you might even be planning more around big projects, so that you don't have, a massive shortage of, say, construction skills, and you've got two major projects going on at the same time, and then periods of unemployment. But you might nationally plan a bit more, so that you've got skills that can be developed and moved on into different projects. And some of that thinking does require a role of the state, which is an instinctive place for the government, but they've got to get into that space, because that's, I think, what our nation's going to demand in order to stay competitive. I think on young people, you make a very important point about job security and housing insecurity. Centrepoint are making that very point, particularly for young people who have less by way of resources, where COVID has actually seen a 50% increase for their services because of family breakdowns and really challenging times. And young people getting less in terms of universal credit and support. We'll also see them sanctioned considerably more as a percentage, which is one of the reasons why we think sanctions are just utterly ridiculous to be bringing back at this time. It compounds the fear and the stress at this time. So there's a kind of collective piece. I think we need to look at the life of young people much more holistically than we currently do. And I think that's a space that the Labour Party is starting to step into.
Dina, can I move over to Andy now, because I'm just keeping my eye on the time. Sorry to cut you off, Andy. Really keen to get your thoughts too.
Once SEMA gets going, I tell you.
Exactly.
No, all pertinent points. And what you're saying about the role of government certainly in terms of infrastructure projects, when I was in the transport brief and promoting the renationalisation of the railway. Fine document, I recommend it to everybody. But it did lay bare some of those concepts about the casualisation of work, the contracting out, people having that insecurity in those circumstances, which you would remove if they were a part of an organisation that gave them career development pathways. And if you had investment in infrastructure where the government would plan, you could, for example, my intention was to have 2 teams on a rolling programme of electrification of the core, because that's critical. Those jobs would be harking back to the sort of thing that Martin was alluding to. I could foresee a situation where people would enter that industry and do have lifelong careers in them. But it comes back to Andy's original point, or rather, not Andy mentioned it was somebody else who mentioned it. It was Josh mentioned around whether this is the flip side or the positive side, reasons to be cheerful or reasons to be concerned about automation. But ultimately, Martin's hit upon this critical point about where the protections lie. Is it around the individual being protected in the workplace, or is it around the collective having the power to negotiate terms and conditions on that sectoral basis? It's a really, really important element. But given that we've only got 6.5 million of our working population, 30 million people in trade unions, we are way below base. And if we had a better representation in those workplaces, greater numbers of people in trade unions, that would have an immediate impact. But Martin's hit upon really critical issues for us over the next 10 or 15 years. And I wouldn't pretend to have the answers to that entirely. Jill's raised the issue of subcontracting. If that's what Tesco are doing, bringing cleaning services back in-house, of course that would, to me, be a very positive step. If it is to simply expand the duties of other workers to include them, that would be absolutely dreadful and entirely the wrong thing to do. And I bow to better knowledge, and if we've heard about the Ada Lovelace Institute, I shall now look that up with great interest to see what they're doing about the acceptability of monitoring. I will be better informed, and I look forward to the paper that's coming from the Fabian Society in the coming weeks. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. I'm going to just squeeze 2 very short questions in, and we're running out of time, but Selina, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, how do we protect the daytime economy when we raise the minimum wage? So, i.e. coffee shops, because some of those businesses struggle to keep up with the rise of the minimum wage, resulting in having to take staff on and pay them cash in hand.
It's a really difficult balance, isn't it? We all want higher minimum pay, but also does it come at a risk of employment, particularly at this point? And then finally, we're going to hear from Benedict.
Oh yeah, I'm actually a young person that works in the tech sector, so interesting Venn diagram. But there's really low rates of young people joining trade unions, which is a problem for the future. What does the panel think about employee representation on boards and the policy involved in that?
And I've just seen that Andy Jones has asked to speak as well. So Andy, you're the last, really. Andy?
Okay, yeah. Thank you. A quick question around the nature of the jobs the economy is creating. I mean, over the last sort of 3 decades, we've seen a huge structural transformation. We've seen loss of very, very significant numbers of jobs in the manufacturing sector that were typically unionized, well paid, high productivity. The economic growth and job creation we've seen has been in typically the low skill, low productivity kind of areas, hospitality, retail, basic sort of personal services, that sort of sectors. How going forward can we actually get some of those lost manufacturing jobs back? And how can we make sure we secure the new manufacturing jobs that are going to be created to actually keep some of those high paid, high skilled jobs in the country? I mean, I'm thinking of things like electric vehicles, the IT revolution. A lot of those jobs, they're not even getting here. They're going to China, they're going to the Far East. We're not even actually getting them onshore, and we're losing them before we've even started. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Andy. Three really great questions to finish it off on. I'm going to ask, I'll go for first Andy, then Josh, and then Seema. If you could all just make brief remarks as we're...
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief, Andy. Businesses struggling to meet any rate rises in the national minimum wage. I think we've just got to remind ourselves that we've been here before. When the national minimum wage was first introduced, we were told that we would take the economy off a cliff. It didn't happen. I mean, the increases we're talking about are not momentous. They are reasonably modest. And I'm not sure that we'll see people struggling in the way that we perhaps fear. Benedict, on workers on boards, I think if we look at other jurisdictions and particularly look to Germany, when I put together the structure for a nationally integrated railway, workers were there, as were the regions and nations of the country. It works infinitely better. Of course, we've got to work through the duties of those workers on boards because they have a corporate responsibility. But it is managed in other jurisdictions. We know that it can work to everybody's betterment. I think, Andy, on what's described as typically a low skill, I think through the COVID crisis, we've started to re-examine what we define by low skill. I mean, certainly people have been given a lack of respect and dignity in the work that they do, but we're actually recalibrating. And I think we're just finding this definition of who is a key and vital worker is being permanently expanded because we're discovering that everybody is vital. So I think that's important. But getting manufacturing jobs back, we're certainly going to be seeing major challenges with these major tectonic plates moving around with China and the US with trade disputes. It's going to put pressure upon our supply chain and a reflection upon how we reshore a great deal of the work that we do. We are in a healthy position in terms of some of the technological work around EVs. We do have battery plants. It's where government can intervene. If you take your minds back to the last general election, we made a major intervention in that respect, but it requires government's intervention to make sure that those major investments occur. They have to be partners in achieving those advances in technological gains and the jobs that go with it. There's a role for government.
Josh, very briefly.
Yes, so Selina, on the national living wage and raising it and protecting particularly small businesses at the same time. Oh yeah, obviously, as has been said, there's a fine line to walk, and there were pieces from other economists and other think tanks before this year's very significant rise in the national living wage. As the COVID crisis was unfolding, there were worries about whether that was going to push some firms over the edge. Well, we don't know whether that particular part of this huge crisis has played a role, but the government did go ahead with that national living wage increase. But what we're saying as part of our recommendation in this report is that we're suggesting that these increases should be staged. We're talking about the middle of the decade by this the middle of the decade as a target for when we should reach this aspiration of 2/3 of median earnings as the level of the minimum wage. So in the depths of recession, the increases shouldn't be front loaded into that time period, if that makes sense. It makes more sense perhaps to take place after we're out of the worst of it. That's my view on that. Benedict, in terms of employee representation on boards, this is actually like a sort of personal interest of mine. I did my master's thesis on employee representation on boards, so I'm very interested in the area. In one of the other chapters of the Commission's report on representation and voice, we do make a proposal around this and suggest it's important for workers to have a role in determining the strategy of companies when they're deciding whether to implement new technology and how exactly they implement it. So I agree with you about that. I think there's also an interaction with job quality there in terms of workers determining the role that their employer plays, you know, around meaningfulness and the purpose of work and autonomy as well. Andy, with regard to manufacturing jobs and how we kind of build up strength in that industry again, I think a lot of the issues that we've come across in terms of the UK actually being very slow to adopt and invest in new technology. I think there's a lot to be said for a more effective and more concerted approach to, you know, government and public investment in innovation and also adoption across the economy of new technology. Because essentially more manufacturing firms need to be able to invest and have access to the new technologies to compete with counterparts around the world. And the story on investment in and spread and diffusion of new technologies across the economy hasn't been a successful one in the UK in the last few years. So that's something that's got to turn around if we're to re-energise manufacturing.
Josh, thank you. And then the last word to Seema.
Great, thank you very much. I think really excellent questions. Just very brief responses on them. On the question about the raising of the minimum wage, I'll just relate a story that I heard from an employer when they related their experience of going up to the national living wage. They actually saw a drop in turnover of from about 15% to about 5%, and they saw a measured sort of a kind of measurable increase in staff satisfaction. So there are positives, and I think there's got to be a stronger evidence base to sometimes provide some more reassurance about where there might be savings rather than extra cost. It's not the full answer, but it certainly is a place to sort of shift the conversation. The second around workers on boards and trade unions. Look, Andy laid out the statistic I was about to share when Andy Harrop moved me on, but I think it's look, what's my experience has been of this crisis is with people losing their jobs, the first thing I'm saying to them is, are you a member of a trade union? And the next question I'm getting back is it too late to join? And that's what's heartbreaking. People, I don't think, realize the importance of the collective until it's a little bit late. This is a moment in which, in my view, we need to look at a sort of new unionism, and maybe some of the works coming out from the Fabian report can help redefine that. I think there's a whole conference in its own right about what the story is of what unions are doing today, because just over 6 million out of a working age population around 30 million isn't enough for what is needed, particularly in the modern day. So I think that, you know, there is a question also about and what goes on in the workplace, as well as representation as a collective. And I personally am very much in favour of workers on boards. And just in terms of manufacturing, I hope there's a moment in which, in the sort of new world we're going to see, particularly after January, we don't talk about Brexit, but it's coming in some form. But we're going to have to look at how we're going to invest much more, you know, kind of consistently and wisely, and create opportunity. One story I would share from conversations happening around Heathrow and how are we going to deal with the possible joblessness and create new opportunities. It's been very interesting to see employers and education institutions like FE and universities coming together, and with industry, and taking the example of electric vehicles, what it would take to create a new workforce, how those training facilities would need to be built, and where would be the places to do them that would be large enough, safe enough, and accessible enough. That's some quite useful, fresh thinking, and it's taken a crisis to bring it forward. It should have been part of how we're working together as a country anyway, for where we need to grow our economy and how we need to engage people in that economic growth.
Nina, thanks very much. Thank you to all of you for being part of the conversation tonight, particularly to Josh, to Seema and to Andy for their contributions. That's probably the last Fabian Online meeting for a little while as we head into the autumn, but into the summer period. But I fear we may be back in the autumn with lots more because social distancing is going to be with us for some time. So have a great summer break. I hope it is a safe one as well, and we'll see you at a Fabian Society meeting soon. Thank you very much.